My first guest is leading an incredible life. He was born and raised in the gang ridden neighborhoods of Los Angeles. After a tumultuous upbringing, he completed a degree in finance while working at the Federal Reserve Bank at night. Following graduation, in 1989, he ventured to a dozen countries across Europe where, for the first time, he discovered what it meant to be an American, both good and bad. 2 years later, he was back in South Los Angeles teaching public school at Compton High School, but was anxious to continue his world travels. And in 1991, he landed in, of all places for a brother, Osaka, Japan, and found work as an English teacher at a well respected college. We're going to let him pick up the story from there. He is the author of 21 Years of Wisdom, One Man's Extraordinary Triumph in Osaka, Japan, a memoir by Darrell Gartrell. Darrell, good afternoon's greeting. Welcome, and welcome to the Karen Hunter Show.
It is great to be with you finally. Thank you for having me.
Oh man, you had to put the finally in there, didn't you?
I did. I've been waiting on that call for a while, but I appreciate you remembering me. Thanks so much. I appreciate it a lot. Thanks.
And what does that show? That patience does pay off.
It really does. And when you live in Japan for a couple of decades, if you don't learn anything else, you learn about patience. Trust me.
Before we get into the details of the book,
right.
When I was reading your bio, you say you ventured to a dozen countries across Europe where, for the first time, you discovered what it meant to be an American. What do you mean by that?
Well, when you're born and raised here in America, you have this, you're sort of taught that the sun rises and sets here, and that, the only history you really learn is of American history. So, when I went over to Europe, I suddenly found myself encountering people who not only knew their own history in depth, which I didn't know anything about, of course, but they knew my history as well. And these were people, young people my age, and many times younger, who spoke multiple languages, and that was sort of a culture shock for me. And also, when I left the country, I was actually able to sort of detach myself from the American culture, immerse myself in a foreign culture for the first time. So I was able to actually look at America more objectively as opposed to when I was raised in the States. You don't really know what culture means until you actually detach yourself from it.
You know what? I'm so glad to hear you say that. There's a brother, Dr. Mac Jones, who's one of the preeminent political scientists in the country. He wrote an article a number of years ago called Message from a Black Political Scientist. And the point he makes there is that as a political scientist, as an African-American political scientist, I had to develop my own, what he called a Weltanschauung, or worldview.
Yes.
That we could not, as political scientists, we can't develop our thought process based upon the American construct, that we have to look at things from a much broader, different perspective if we want to truly be objective. And I think you can attest to this. Americans are some of the least traveled people in the world and some of the most illiterate people in the world. And so when you do get outside the country, man, it's a whole different world out there.
It really is. I think you hit the nail right on the head there. I think that, for lack of a better term, there's sort of a brainwashing that takes place amongst Americans, and I think that once I left the United States, I had to come to terms with that. That was not necessarily easy because here I was, a college graduate, and with the ego attached, you think, okay, I got my degree, I studied this, that, and the other, so I pretty much know what's going on. Then you discover that I don't know a darn thing.
Right.
Right. So that was a rude awakening for me, but fortunately it set me on the path to, let's say, a path of discovery, self-discovery.
So you open your book, chapter 1, Driven Insane, and you open with this story about driving in Japan at 4:00 in the morning. Why did you open with that particular scene, and then explain to the audience what transpired?
Okay, well, we're talking about writing a memoir here, so you want to, and this was a steep learning curve for me, obviously, my first memoir project. And so what I come to understand is that you want to draw the audience in immediately to the most, perhaps one of the most interesting components or experiences that you had. So I chose that particular story because it does literally take the reader by the collar and drags them into my experience. So there's no, there was this thought that, okay, why don't we just start it from the beginning, chronologically, from when you were little, and just walk us through. And I felt that, we're going to take a different approach. And so that's where we started. Now, you mentioned the driver license story. Simple enough. Pulled over, 4:00 in the morning. Mind you, let's look at the broader context. I was riding in a very expensive car, 4:00 in the morning, in an environment where it's not like Los Angeles, where I grew up, where, as an African American, you're subject to suspicion, on any given evening, particularly if you're driving an expensive car in certain parts of town. So I was pulled over. It was a very benevolent officer, pulls me over. We chat. He asked for my license. I gave him an international license. He says, well, long story short, he goes, well, these are no longer valid. You're going to have to come down to the station. I went down to the station, and again, everything was very cordial. And so I went down to the station the following week and then determined that, okay, I was going to have to get a proper Japanese driver license. And I actually had to go back to driving school, and I reflected on that experience in the book, and most people get a real kick out of that.
Yeah, that's a very, very funny story. In fact, you have one just paragraph here. To my chagrin, I slightly bowed my head and apologized and promised to make much greater effort the next time.
Well, we had to, people think of driving school and taking the driving test, and, for the Americans at least, we hop behind the wheel, we make a right turn, make a left turn, we back up, we park. It's a done deal. It's a wrap. Not so in Japan. In Japan, there's a whole ritual behind the process, which entails how you enter the car, how you adjust your mirrors, in what sequence, what speed, how you put on your harness. And then once you actually start driving, then it's a whole different ball game. How rapidly or how slowly did you come to a full stop? When you made that right turn, how many inches exactly were you to the curb? So they measured so many minor points, and then it actually took me a very, very long time to actually pass that test. So I walked the reader through this whole experience, and most people found it pretty phenomenal.
And and can you talk about what is it about Japanese culture that takes them through those types of process? What did you learn about Japanese culture that has them pay such attention to such levels of detail?
Well, again, you mentioned at the top of the show that it's all about patience, with Japanese. They're not going to have you, Joe Blow foreigner, coming over there and getting involved in any road rage.
Right.
So you've got to control your temper. You've got to show restraint. You got to show respect. You have to show courtesy. These are cornerstones of Japanese culture. And after a couple of decades of living there, these were concepts that I learned to embrace over time, which had a tremendous impact on my personal and professional life.
You start your second chapter, the the Los Angeles grind. You say, my odyssey to Japan started on the smog-choked freeways of Los Angeles, where I shed plenty of rubber commuting back and forth to California State University in pursuit of a finance degree. So take us back to, how did your odyssey to Japan start on those smog-choked freeways?
Well, this was the grind of the 1980s. It was tough back then. I was going to night school, trying to finish my degree. I was on the 10-year plan. They didn't even have a 10-year plan, so I made my own. Working full time, actually going to school part time at night. Finally finished my degree. Met a young man at a part-time job that I was doing, and in a mailroom, as a matter of fact. And he was a Stanford student, and while we were working in the mailroom that summer, I believe that was 1989, he shared with me his experiences of traveling abroad. And I thought that was the most bizarre thing I had ever heard. I assumed that as an African American, if you were going to travel abroad, you had to be either in the military, you had to be a famous musician. I couldn't really conceive of a guy just up and going overseas. But long story short, he showed me how he did it on the cheap. And then I found myself that few months later on a direct flight from LAX to Paris, where it was a one-way ticket, and I immediately got a job in a soup kitchen, and washing dishes and whatnot. What did I care? I'm in Europe, I'm traveling, I'm making a little change so I can continue my travel. So that actually changed my whole life, that experience.
But now let's talk a little bit about mindset, because you did not leave Los Angeles and go to Paris. Well, you were going as a tourist, but there was more to your adventure than just seeing the Eiffel Tower, going to the Louvre, and looking at the Mona Lisa. So I mean, when you talk about working in a soup kitchen, you're going there with a different mindset.
Absolutely. There was so much culture shock once I arrived in Paris itself. Nothing was the way I thought it was going to be. Here I was, 28 years old, just finished, got out of college, stumbled over to Paris on a one-way ticket. And when I arrived, I just witnessed and saw things that I just could not have imagined before. And remember, I was on a third-class adventure, as opposed to staying in a nice hotel for a few days and taking a touristy tour or whatever and going back home. So I was there to stay for a couple of months, which I did. So I didn't just I started in Paris, but I ended up getting a Eurail pass, which I had purchased prior, which allowed you to travel around the continent, which I did, and my goodness, I went to Italy, and I went to Holland, and I went all through Germany, and so I went pretty much all over Western Europe, and I ended up staying there actually 2 years. And I worked all over. I worked in Amsterdam, worked in Austria at a youth hostel. I stepped on grapes in the south of France. And I learned to speak French, and I polished up my Spanish in Spain, Andalusia, in the Spain area. So, no, my life was radically changed. I just couldn't go back. The old me was dead and gone. So it was a rebirth for me at that time.
You write, exploring Western Europe had changed my life in a profound way. Countless interactions, occurrences, moments, events, and stories shaped not only my immediate journey, but my future trajectory as well. And what I want to try and drill down into is mindset, because you and I both know that there are too many African Americans that can't fathom what you did because of their mindset. So can you? And I hope I'm expressing this clearly.
Yes.
Because it's worldview,
yes.
and it's the desire to actually want to go out and experience something different. Especially, and I'll stereotype here. Especially from a brother from South Central Los Angeles.
Right. Well, I can tell you the mindset that I had to overcome was fear and doubt, and I think that's.
Thank you. That's what I want you to get to.
Yes,
Thank you.
That predominates our culture as African Americans, and my message to young people is to confront that fear, confront that doubt, and attack it, embrace it. I mean, I broke free. And once I was over there, I had never felt experienced freedom before. What do I mean by freedom? I wasn't stereotyped. When I went over there, people were wanting to meet me, talk to me, inviting me to lunch, inviting me to their homes, wanting to work with me. I had never before experienced what it was like to have someone to address me as me. And so whereas here in America, we're a part of a downtrodden caste. We're members of a caste.
Right.
And we're treated as such, but we accept it because culturally this is what is going on in America. So we have to figure out a way to say, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and do this. Nothing's going to happen to you. You're not going to end up dead in the street. Most people think the absolute worst is going to happen to them if they just break the bonds and break free. But there's so much more opportunity that I found overseas for many African Americans, maybe even most, than there is in our home country, in my experience.
I went to Iran in October and I went back in February. And when I told friends of mine that I was going to go to Iran, they wait a minute, man, you're doing what? What? You're doing what? You're going to get kidnapped and they're going to cut off your head. If you don't know how many times I heard, or they said, if they don't kidnap you and cut off your head, they're going to cut off your head, then they're going to kidnap you.
Right.
And, and I even had some folks who wanted to come to my house and have an intervention. Seriously have an intervention to convince me not to go. And that was one of the most wonderful trips and experiences that I've had to date. And so, in reading your book and listening to you now, talking about the change of mindset to me is so important. You write here, one of my dozens of chance meetings involved a young lady named Haruko from Osaka, Japan, which I imagined to be somewhere near the Himalayas. Geography's a mother, ain't it?
It is, and particularly, growing up, again, I had the degree and everything, but we didn't focus on geography,
Right.
And then this young lady we met, again, one of so many travelers that I had come across, and we exchanged information. And then when I got back to the States, I found some information from her. She sent me a magazine and a letter, and she said, well, why don't you, if ever you come to Japan, why don't you look me up? And so there was no internet at that particular time. That was back in the early 90s, 1990 actually. And then I said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I ended up teaching at Compton High for a year, and then following that school year, I said I'm going to go ahead and go over to Asia to travel around. I'm going to start in Osaka. And then when I arrived in Osaka, I was like, no, my goodness, this is the spot.
Well, wait a minute. Before
anywhere else. This is it.
You know what? I just lost my. The other thing I wanted to get to quickly about mindset, because as you talked about, let me ask it this way: when you told friends of yours that you were going to travel through Europe, did anybody tell you, man, that's what white people do?
I had not in those words, but there were, there was disdain. And there was ambivalence, and there was negativity, certainly. And people looked at me like I was leaving the planet.
Right.
They could not identify. And you know what? It's ironic. It was worse when I got back. So when I got back to the States, I tried to share with everyone, that what a transformation I had gone through and how radically different the world is relative to what we've been taught here in the States. I couldn't get anyone's attention.
What's that got to do with the Dodgers game, man?
You know what I mean? Oh my goodness, they were so close-minded. And we're talking about members of my immediate family, close friends, people I knew for years. They didn't want to hear it. And they would say, "Oh, well, that's so nice. I have a friend. Our friend went to Jamaica last summer. They had a great time." And so, that's just basically code for like, okay, get out of here now. And of course,
shut up. Enough of this.
Shut up. We've had enough. So I was so frustrated. I said, you know what? I can't even relate to these people anymore. So I got to get out of here. And that's when, the following year, I went off to Japan to continue my journey.
So talk about quickly about a little more detail about when you came back.
Right.
Because you say you were now beginning to question America's claim to be the greatest country on earth. Greatest for who, I wondered. Not for my friends William Morris, David Adams, or even Sophia, all murdered, their only crime being born, quote unquote, free in America. That right there, that was a pretty profound.
Growing up in South L.A., obviously we witnessed a lot of deaths.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of black-on-black crime, but a lot of, police they had open season on blacks. That's no secret today.
Mm-hmm.
But once again, I just thought it was normal. I didn't know any different. And then here I am in Europe, and I felt absolutely no sense of danger. There was no gang activity that I ran across. There was no police officers shining lights in my face, frisking me, asking me for ID every other block. It never happened whatsoever. And I'm talking about walking around at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, willy-nilly, and there was no sense of danger. And I'm like, my goodness, what is this? And it took me a while to embrace that notion, because the idea of walking around in South L.A., particularly at that time, walking around past a given hour, that was basically suicidal, unless you just really, knew what you were doing. But I felt absolute freedom once I arrived in Europe, and it was unknown to me until that time.
2 quick paragraphs. In the end, I had to keep the most significant lessons I had learned to myself, that America is indeed a great country, but only for about half of its citizens. Its well-oiled propaganda apparatus through Hollywood pictures, financial influence, and military might extol an ideology of supremacy best suitable to myth. In Europe, the experience of being recognized and respected as a unique spirit instead of a card-carrying member of an inferior caste was refreshing as it was addictive. It was time to plant my flag elsewhere, and that elsewhere would be Japan. Well written, man.
I appreciate that. It was heartfelt.
That's good stuff. That's very poignant and real. That's real talk. That's real talk.
It was expressed from the heart, truly.
How does it sound to you to have what you've written read by somebody else?
That is the first time I've actually heard that, and it's awe-inspiring. I can assure you, it's surreal.
Interesting. So now we go to Japan.
Yep.
Let's do this. Let me. We're gonna pause for the cause. Let's do this. In fact, we've also got some callers. Let me say to the audience, this is the Karen Hunter Show. You're listening to the Karen Hunter Show, but obviously I am not Karen Hunter. Dr. Wilmer Leon here, sitting in for Karen Hunter today on the Karen Hunter Show. 866-801-TALK. Grab a line. I got so wrapped up in talking to Darrell Gartrell that I forgot that you all might want to talk to him too. 866-801-TALK, like Mike in New York. We're going to get to him on the other side of this break. 866-801-8255, 866-801-8255. Grab a line if you want to talk to Darrell Gartrell, Gartrell, just like it sounds. 21 years of wisdom, one man's extraordinary triumph in Osaka, Japan is the book. And we're coming up on 28. We're 28 past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here, sitting in for Karen Hunter. Do yourselves a favor, folks. Keep it locked right here. Sirius XM 126, The Urban View.
The hottest show on radio. Raw and insightful interviews with movers, shakers, tastemakers, and experts. This is The Karen Hunter Show.
Everybody do the mess around. Ray Charles. Well, let that play. Barbecue. Yeah, what's happening, America? This is 30 minutes past the hour. That's Ray Charles, the mess around. That one's hard to find. But that's, Great. Early Ray Charles cut the mess around. And Darrell Gartrell is my guest. 21 Years of Wisdom, One Man's Extraordinary Triumph in Osaka, Japan, memoir. Darrell, thank you so much for staying with me. And
my pleasure.
We're gonna get to our callers in just a minute. You go back to Japan, and so talk about how you got into teaching English, and you became a very, very successful business owner in Japan.
Yes, I did. When I first arrived in Japan, I saw opportunity everywhere. I was fortunate enough to get hired by a popular college in downtown Osaka. And then after the first year, my graduating students were so excited by my lesson, they were like, well, can we study with you after we finish school? And I said, well, that'd be great. And I started teaching English at my home privately. And even prior to that, before I started working for the college, I was tutoring at McDonald's because I didn't have an apartment. I was staying at a hostel. Long story short, my lessons became so popular that my student body peaked at about 800 students at that one location. Of course, by then we had moved into a larger facility. I hired 30 full-time teachers, and of course, over time we branched out nationwide. The school was called Wisdom 21, thus the basis for the book title, 21 Years of Wisdom.
And you wound up having some serious problems as well.
Well, there were challenges. There were growing pains. I had to learn the language. I had to learn the culture, the nuances of the culture. I'm sort of giving you the short story.
Right.
Obviously, it took.
We do want people to read the book.
Well, yeah, that too, but I want them to get a sense as to how the book was actually built. The school was actually built. It wasn't that I just went over there and automatically opened up a school. Obviously, there's certain barriers as a foreigner. You just can't waltz into Japan and announce you want to open up a school. There's a process there. And part of that process is embracing the culture, and a lot of Westerners have difficulty, embracing the subtleties of Asian culture. You can't just come over there and expect people to do things your way. Mm-hmm. So I was very successful at learning the language and the culture, and I was able to develop some partnerships early on that helped me put together those pieces.
Let's do this. Let's go to our live line on line one. Mike in New York. Good afternoon. You're on the Karen Hunter Show with Wilmer Leon and Darrell Gartrell.
Hi, Mike.
Hello. How you doing, sir?
Doing great.
I just want to get on the topic. I was in the military and I was stationed in Germany, and I tell you guys, it was just so mind-blowing of, the whole atmosphere and how everything is laid out. And being from New York, you always get this sense of, nothing's bigger than New York, nothing's better than New York. But once you get out and you explore all these different cultures and avenues, oh, my God, it is a teaching within itself. And as long as you're opening, to adapting to the way people live and their courtesies and, their language, and you're trying, it was such a great experience. And I try to tell my family members about it and things like that, but they just don't understand it. And it's something that you can't understand until you actually do it.
You're absolutely right, Mike. What do you say, Darrell?
Well, I think he's right on point there. He had the good fortune of being in the military. He
Thanks,
traveled
Mike.
somewhat, although being in the military oftentimes it's sort of you're sort of in a bubble, and you're not able to really get out into the culture and mix the way you could if you were independent. But he recognized the advantages and benefits. And I got to tip my hat off to you, Mike.
Absolutely. And even, I'm glad you mentioned that whole bubble thing, because I thought about that as well. When you go to a foreign country as a member of the American military, you bring in not that Mike did this, but many people bring a certain that American mentality with them. And being in that uniform and serving as a member of the U.S. military, you bring that dominant American mindset, which in some instances can be a hindrance.
Well, there's no question about that. When you travel with other Americans, and you have American television, and you have American food, and you have buddies that you're talking in English with. So, yeah, that will sort of buffer your experience. There's no question about that. But I have to compliment Mike. He did get a dose. He got a dose of what it was like, and that dosage, it changed him. I can see that. So I commend his effort.
And that Eurail pass that you talked about is a tremendous thing, being able to travel on trains all throughout Europe, and all you do is flash that pass and keep it moving.
You know what? I cannot express enough how impactful that pass was in my life. Again, you hop on that train, and, you know, in some cases, because I was a budget traveler, I didn't have any money, so I couldn't get a room or a hotel, so sometimes I just hop on an overnighter, and I hop on a train in Paris. I wake up in Spain the next day,
Exactly.
Having a good night's sleep. So I did that for several trips. I took overnighters, ended up in Sweden and Denmark, and every time I got off the train, it was a new adventure. And let me tell you, people were greeting me, they were welcoming me, they were inviting me here and there. So it wasn't like I was just stranger stumbling around. I was making friends all over the place, local friends.
Yvonne on 2. Yvonne in California. Good afternoon.
Oh, yes. Good afternoon.
You're on with the Karen Hunter Show with Wilmer Leon and Darrell Gartrell.
Hi, Yvonne.
Yes. Hi, Mr. Gartrell. And I just wanted to say, I think this program is really, really great. And I hope a lot of people get something out of it in listening to you and your travels, because so many people really need to hear this. I was a flight attendant for 43 years.
Whoa.
And I traveled all around the world, and I even lived in Europe too, because I eventually married someone from Italy. But I just wanted to say that you're right. It's really like propaganda. When you hear from friends, when you come back and they'll say, "Oh, well, United States is the greatest country in the world," and you kind of like just don't say nothing because you don't.
Yeah.
It's blasphemous if you disagree.
Yeah. Oh, really? Well, have you been to Ghana? Have you been to Mozambique? Have you been? There are other places in the world.
That's absolutely
right. So I feel that this program, and it's unfortunately that we're so brainwashed. And I think a lot of black people are like maybe really afraid to travel. Maybe more of us are traveling, but we just